もしやコスモでは。
Cosmo needs me free.
Cosmo AP ラグジュアリースポーツ。
Well, I've just finished the sheet metal, so that means it's time for episode 23. Let me repeat that one more time. I finished the sheet metal! It's been a lot of work since you last saw me in episode 22. The repairs have been mostly the same as the passenger side. I had to repair this whole area of the floor, including the wheel well, this area here, including the inner sill, as on the passenger side. I had to repair the seat bracket. It had rusted out on the flange that was spot welded to the floor. Unlike the passenger side though, this whole section of floor had to be replaced due to pinholes and thin metal. Obviously, this inner kick panel here, as well as all the associated brackets. Moving to the exterior, this whole inner fender section had to be repaired, including this bracket. These two overlapping panels. Obviously this is the exterior view of the kick panel that I replaced. And of course the corner of the outer sill. So, now that the sheet metal is done, man I love saying that. Now that the sheet metal is done, let's move on to some fun stuff. Well, after 2 years of doing nothing but sheet metal, I'm going to switch gears for a little bit and move back into the engine bay. Do some engine-related stuff. Stuff, you know, that I actually enjoy. So, what I'm going to do is reinstall the engine and transmission for mock-up. You know, just holding it in with a few bolts here and there. And then we can start setting up the intakes, wiring the fuel injection. A little bit of tape on this bracket might protect the paint, although I have a feeling I'll probably be blasting and painting it again. Oh, this is not fun. Really high center of gravity. So 300 pounds of metal in the air. Terrifying. Okay, I should just be able to lift the back up a bit, manhandle it into place. There we are. One. Let's get a bolt on there. Bolt on this one. Okay. Now these engine mounts are 84 GSL-SE RX-7 mounts. It's the closest thing I could find because I can't exactly just go down to the local Mazda dealer and get 76 Cosmo mounts. Oh, shit. On my finger, ow. Oh. Wow, that's enough of a struggle with only about 275 pounds. I can't even imagine how the V8 guys do it, because they're moving like, what, 800 pounds? Okay, let's see if we can do this without scratching the paint. Shut up! I'm doing something a bit weird with the intake manifold, so I think we should probably take a few minutes to go over that and the Megasquirt system that I'm using before we get to the real work. Before I wire in the MS3 Pro, I have to do some intake manifold work. because the combination of manifolds that I'm using on this engine to achieve my goals is just a little bit weird and they don't really fit together. So bear with me and I'll explain it. I'll try to be quick. The engine, as I built it in episode 12, is a combination engine made out of GSL-SE 6-port irons and Cosmo housings. Now I have a lot of experience with 6-port turbos, and this engine is going to be sort of the culmination of everything that I've learned. So to all the rotary guys who are familiar with the layouts of the 4-port turbo versus the 6-port NA engine, I'll just say that this is a turbo NA 6-port engine with functional 6 ports. Now the people who don't know anything about rotaries are probably wondering, what the hell is he talking about? So let me just show you. Starting in '84, Mazda made all of their NA rotaries 6-port. We have a primary port here and an auxiliary port here. Think of it as variable intake timing. At low RPM, the auxiliary port stays closed, and then at high RPM, above 3800 RPM I think, the intake port opens up. And what you have now is port timing designed for high RPM operation. The auxiliary port has a lot later closing time than the secondary ports, so it's more tuned for high RPM operation. If you leave these ports open at low RPM, you're losing about 25% of your low-end torque. Why? Because this is a huge amount of port area. Air speeds at low RPM are not fast enough to allow proper chamber filling with this long duration auxiliary port that actually cuts slightly into the compression stroke. So what you end up with is a lot of intake reversion, very low intake velocity, and poor filling. So lack of low-end torque. So my design is a turbo 6-port engine with functional auxiliary ports that remain closed at low RPM, so there's very, very conservative port timing. And then whenever I feel that they should open, we'll determine this on the dyno or the street, I will open them using a solenoid and a signal from the megasquirt. Now, here's the thing. These things are a rotating sleeve. See? This is the manifold these irons are designed to operate with. They have a pneumatic actuator right here that rotates a rod which turns the sleeve. So, I can demonstrate. The sleeve opens, the sleeve closes. This is a 84 GSL-SE RX-7 intake manifold. I've done some basic calculations, and I need the longest runner length possible in order to achieve my goals. My rough calculations say that in order to have a torque peak below 4,000 RPM, I'm really hoping for around 3,000, 3,500 RPM, I need runners about 30 inches long. That's not going to happen in this engine bay. There just isn't enough room. So, basically, I want the longest runners I can fit in the engine bay. Anybody who has seen the upper intakes on the RX-8 and the NA 92 to 86 RX-7s can attest to how long those intake runners actually are. Now, what I'm going to use is a 3rd generation FD RX-7 upper intake manifold. Longest runners of all the turbo RX-7s, plus hell, it's just a nice looking manifold. So my job is to build an adapter which allows these two manifolds to mate with as much runner between here and here as I can fit. Now before I dive right into the intake manifold stuff, I think I'm going to warm up my potentially rusty TIG welding skills by welding these -6 bungs onto my primary fuel rail. Incidentally, that is the fuel rail from either S4 or GSL-SE RX-7. Now this thing is cast aluminum, which is always a bit funky to TIG weld because of contamination. some nasty stuff. But it's done. Fuel rail, done. Mazda obviously had no intention of ever making a 95 FD upper intake made with a 84 SE lower intake. But you can see, if I take the intake gaskets and line them up, the runners are really close. So it won't be too hard for me to build a manifold that goes between them, which can not only add the runner height that I need, but also match up the ports. Okay, well first I have to make a set of flanges. I'm going to start with the FD manifold, and it's a little bit less than 10 inches, so 10 inches will be the width of my flange to start. I'm going to use this beautiful piece of 1/2 inch thick aluminum. First though, I just need to cut a piece about 10 inches. Okay, I'm going to start this process by drilling the stud holes. I've left the raw material as large as possible, which will make it a lot easier to handle and clamp down while I drill all these holes, and then I can cut it to the shape afterwards. I'm going to be putting studs in these holes, so they have to be about as close as I can make them. This is the first intricate project I'm doing with my brand new drill press, so I'm pretty excited. I'm drilling these holes out slowly for 1/8 inch, and then I'll drill them out to the final diameter. The reason I keep backing up on the bit is so that it doesn't get clogged with aluminum. Okay, now I'm drilling the holes out to their final size, which is 6.8 millimeters. That's the appropriate size to be tapped to M8 by 1.25. Okay, all 5 holes drilled. Clean off the back side with a file. There we go. Well, you can't complain too much about that. The holes didn't really walk at all. Now, here's where things get a bit weird. The primary runners are about 1 1/4 inches in diameter. The secondary runners are 1 1/2. Because the primary runners don't line up very well, here's the SE gasket over the FD tracing, what I'm going to do is drill every runner with a hole saw 1/4 inch smaller than their final diameter. I have enough play between the differences of the 2 gaskets to port the flange to match the runners, which I'm going to install to split the difference between the positions of these holes. Can you follow that? What that will allow me to do is keep the runners straight up and down, much more aesthetically pleasing, and also a hell of a lot easier to fabricate. Because these holes don't have to be exactly precise, I'm just center punching them by reducing the diameter of the hole with the hole saw, and then center punching in what looks like to be the center of the mandrel mount of the hole saw. Okay, and finally, I'll just cut this sucker to its final shape. Now, eventually I may cut it to fit these contours of the upper, but we'll see how much free time I have on my hands. Holy crap, this is a lot of cutting. I think I've been at this for about half an hour. Probably could have used 3/8 inch instead of 1/2 inch. Woo! And that's the first flange, all done. Off camera, I made the flange for the SE manifold side in exactly the same way as the FD manifold. The only difference is I cut it to follow the contour of the manifold. And the reason I just duct taped a FD manifold to a piece of aluminum should now be obvious. Okay, it looks like 5.5 inches is the longest I can make my runners before I hit the hood. Now that's not too bad, because that gives me a total runner length of about 28 inches. Okay, so the runners are cut, and now I'm simply tracing the runners onto the flange. What I've done is I've traced the FD runners onto the SE flange in blue and the SE gasket in green. So to position these runners, all I kind of have to do here is split the difference, and that way I can port match to the appropriate manifold on each side. Now this material is way past the capabilities of my Econo-TIG, so getting these tacks on is going to be a bit of a pain. But on final welding, once the material warms up, it shouldn't be too bad. I'm trying to figure out how to position the top flange for welding to try to keep these somewhat square so the manifold doesn't look like it's rotated on the engine. And the best method I can come up with, since these holes basically match in both manifolds, is to use some threaded rod, send it through the holes, bolt it to both manifolds, and then I can kind of adjust it square and then tighten down the bolts to sort of hold it in place. That's kind of what I'm going for. It seems to hold it pretty well. Oh, this is massively awkward to tack. I wish my welder had about 50 more amps. Okay, now that it's cooled down to the point where I can barely touch it, going to pull these rods out, hop her on the car, and if everything looks like it fits, I'll do all the final welding around these outer runners. Okay, well, I know it'll fit, but just because I want to see it on there, let's bolt it in place. There we go. Not bad. Now, don't tell anyone, but there's a little bit of play in this manifold. So if it's not perfectly straight, I can use the slack in the bolt hole to line it up. I thought that the constant heat input from the welder would make things a little bit easier now that I'm fully welding in the runners, but the fact is, this material is just out of the capabilities of what my Econotig was designed for. I need about 50 more amps than my welder can provide to actually weld this comfortably. I'm having to run the welder completely at wide open throttle and pause in every area that I want to make a puddle for a very long time. It's not making a very good weld, but at least it's going to be strong enough for the purpose. I'd never ever suggest that in a structural application, not enough welding current is a valid way of welding something together. However, in this application, it's okay. It's still pretty challenging though. Think about welding with an underpowered welder, a bit like trying to convince your girlfriend to bring another woman into the bed. Yeah, you might be able to do it, but it's going to require a lot of skill, a lot of patience, probably some prior experience, and you're going to have troubles along the way. Whew. Not pretty, and got some aluminum on my tungsten, but I'm done. Finished just in time, baby, just in time. I just finished cutting the two primary runners and filing them to fit. And it's immediately obvious that right in here is going to be a real whore to weld. I should mention that the outer secondary runners are 1.5 inch pipe, which has an inner diameter of 1.5 inches, whereas the primary runners are 1.5 inch tubing, which has an inner diameter of 1.25 inches. Pipe is measured by inside diameter, tubing is measured by outside diameter, so you have to keep the wall thickness of the tubing in mind when trying to figure out the inside diameter. Okay, well, I'm just positioning the final runner to weld it in place. Trying to line it up as best I can with the existing runner. Now, I realize that there's basically zero chance of me being able to weld in here. So, what I'm going to do is, once the runners are fully welded in and the ports are matched, I'm going to weld on the inside of the port around the rim just to seal this off completely, and then I'll cheat and use some epoxy there to make it look like there's a continuous weld. Because frankly, no one could make that weld. Well, okay, maybe Chuck Norris, but of course Chuck Norris doesn't use a torch to weld. Chuck Norris just stares at the metal and the molecules become frightened and huddled together. Now time to do the port matching. So I'm starting off by first marking the ports with a little bit of blue marker so that I have some contrast for when I scribe the port lines. The ports in the gasket are actually just a little bit bigger than the ports in the manifold on the FD side. So what I'll do is, after I've ported this to match the gasket, I will go back to the actual FD manifold and do some port matching so it will match the gasket as well. All we do is now take our compass and scratch in the port. Being careful not to damage the gasket because these things are like 20 bucks each. There we go. After many, many years of experience grinding aluminum with a Dremel tool, I've learned that there are two styles of bits that work really well. The first is a rotary file. It's very aggressive and very quick at removing material. However, its major flaw is the fact that the fine file flutes, say that a few times fast, can clog up with aluminum as it warms up and gets a little soft. And then you're stuck for about 5 minutes picking it out with a knife. Now, coating it with wax or a little bit of WD-40 helps, but really it doesn't help that much, and it just ends up adding to the mess. The second style of bit is this thing, and I think it's actually a drywall routing bit. It has much longer and wider flutes, so it doesn't clog, and it is very aggressive at pulling aluminum away. The only problem with the drywall bit is that if you hold it in one spot for too long, it's going to create a groove. And it being of a much smaller diameter than the rotary file, it's a little bit harder to get a consistent shape. And now, about 4 hours later, through the magic of editing, all 8 ports are done. The next step is to just give them a really quick buffing with these little sanding discs. Just about 20 seconds on each port is all that's needed to smooth it down.
I was never really comfortable with the idea of using epoxy to mimic the welds that I couldn't do between the primary and secondary runners. It seems to me like it's kind of like the idea of breast implants, or the huge wing on the back of some front-wheel drive Honda, just there for aesthetics only, serving no real purpose. So what I decided to do instead was build up the area between the primary and secondary runners, and then run some weld beads right down the two, thus sealing it up. Also, this actually mimics the way the stock cast manifold is filled in between the runners, so it seems like a pretty good solution. By the way, in order to get this footage, what I did was I took apart an old welding helmet and duct taped the lens to the lens of the camera. Pretty cool, eh?
Oh, over duty. Fair enough though. Now that all the potentially hole and thread damaging flange welding is done, I guess I'll take the opportunity now to tap out these stud holes. Just gonna get that tap reasonably lined up. There we go. Tapping this aluminum is a real pain because it clogs up the tap really easily, and you only get about 1/4 of a turn before you have to back it out and clear the flutes. Of course, if you just keep going, it'll clog up, the tap will break off in the hole, and then it'll be a world of hurt. And that is a tapped hole. With all that welding finally behind me, the last major step is to mount these DIY auto-tune EV14 style injector bungs on the secondary runners. I just drilled was for this small jig-like bracket. And what that is allowing me to do is mount the lower sections of these injector holders reasonably straight so that I can position them on the manifold and weld them without them moving around a lot from the heat. Kind of like that. Of course, before I do any welding, I need to drill the hole for the fuel to shoot through. So I made these marks on each side, which not only look like boobs, but they represent the bottom of this hole. So I just need to drill like a 1/2 inch hole above them. Okay, before I do the final welding, it's vital that my aluminum be clean. So, every time I weld aluminum, I follow the same procedure, which is first wipe it down with acetone, then brush it with a stainless steel wire brush. Usually I have room to use a brush mounted on a drill. And then once all the corrosion and junk and leftover tacking burn marks and bits of tungsten and whatnot are removed, wipe it down with acetone again, and only then is it ready to weld. Difficult. And the last part of this that I have to make is a fuel rail. So we'll do that now as soon as I get these injector holder tops in place. They're designed to accept a 1/4 inch NPT fitting so that you can run hose or braided line between them, which is great when you're retrofitting a bunch of these on a manifold. But I don't like that approach for longevity, so what I'm going to do is just build a fuel rail and weld it to the top. I'm cutting an 8.5 inch length of 3/4 inch diameter, 1/8 inch wall aluminum tubing, which will become the fuel rail. Missed. Okay, one quick tack holds it in place, and now I can kind of line it up. Actually, she looks really good. Yep, not bad. So let's give it one more tack, and then once again, a ton of annoying welding. Well, the welding's done, and just to prove that everyone makes mistakes, I want to show you something. I completely trapped the screws. There's no way I can get at these. What I'm going to have to do is cut my Allen key down to about 1/4 inch, so I can just sneak it in there. Well, it's ridiculous, and these bolts are trapped forever, but it works. This thing is also really hot still from welding. And finally, I just need to drill the hole in the actual rail so that fuel can get to the injectors. And with the middle intake manifold mounted back on the engine, episode 23 can draw to a close. And amazingly, there was not even a little sheet metal in this episode. I promise I will continue the trend for episode 24, because in episode 24, I'll be wiring up the Mega Squirt MS3 Pro.